Hey everyone, welcome to East Park. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that South Park is not just a cartoon. It is one of the most accurate prediction machines in the history of television. For over 2 decades, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been writing episodes that most people watched, laughed at, and forgot about, only for the real world to quietly catch up to everything those episodes described. From the rise of Donald Trump to the death of Osama bin Laden, from the MeToo movement to the collapse of Jared Fogle, from the birth of Pokemon Go to the way mobile gaming was engineered to drain your bank account, South Park saw it all coming. Not because Parker and Stone are psychic, not because they have insider information, but because they have always been willing to follow a thought all the way to where it is actually going, without stopping, without looking away, and without waiting for the rest of the world to feel comfortable enough to have the same conversation. These 12 episodes are the proof. They are not coincidences. They are not lucky guesses. They are what happens when two people pay closer attention to the world than almost anyone else on television, write faster than any other show in history, and trust their instincts enough to say the thing nobody else is ready to say yet. But before we begin, I would just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It is completely free, and it really does help us keep making these videos for this wonderful community we have built together. Anyway, that is enough from me. Let us get into it. The Trump Prophecy, Season 19, Episode 2, 2015. Here is something that will mess with your head a little bit. On September 23rd, 2015, South Park aired an episode where a loud, angry man with weird hair runs for office. He wants to build a wall. He says outrageous things. He has no real solutions to any of the problems he talks about. He gets people fired up by blaming immigrants for everything wrong with the country. He calls himself a candidate but acts more like a performance. And everyone around him either laughs at him or goes completely insane trying to stop him. Sound familiar? The episode was called Quote 1 and it aired over a year before the 2016 presidential election. At the time, Donald Trump had just announced his candidacy a few months earlier, in June 2015. Most people thought it was a joke. Political commentators were laughing. Late-night hosts were having a field day. Nobody seriously believed he was going to win anything. The whole country was treating it like a funny story that would go away on its own. South Park was not laughing. They were paying very close attention. The episode opens with Mr. Garrison, the boy's teacher, noticing that a flood of Canadian immigrants have moved into South Park. They are filling up his classroom. They are taking jobs. They are changing the town. And Mr. Garrison is furious about it. He starts wearing a red baseball cap. He starts talking about making the country great again. He goes in front of the whole town and gives a speech about how he is going to build a wall on the border to keep the Canadians out. The crowd goes wild for him. People who were reasonable and calm just days before are now cheering for his most extreme ideas. The angrier he gets, the more people love him. If any of this is starting to feel very familiar to you, that is because it should. But here is where the episode gets really interesting and really dark. Mr. Garrison sneaks into Canada to find out what is going on over there. What he finds is a complete wasteland. Canada has been destroyed. The cities are empty. The streets are falling apart. Everything is in ruins. And the reason for all of this, according to the Canadians he meets, is that they elected a leader just like the one Mr. Garrison is trying to become. The Canadians in the episode explain exactly what happened. There was a candidate. He was loud. He was brash. He said whatever he wanted without thinking about whether it was true. He never offered any real plans. He just said outrageous things and people found it entertaining. And the Canadians, thinking it was all a big joke, let it go on for too long. They kept waiting for it to stop being funny and start being serious. But by the time they realized it was serious, he was already being sworn in. Canada was ruined within a short period of time, and that is why all the Canadians were fleeing to America. The line from the episode that sticks with people most is this one. A Canadian character explains what happened in their country by saying, "Nobody really thought he'd ever be president. It just sort of happened." That line aired in September 2015. Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in November 2016. Parker and Stone, the two men who created South Park, have always written each episode extremely fast. They write, animate, and finish an entire episode in about 6 days. This is what lets them comment on things that are happening in the world right now, not things that happened months ago. When they made this episode, Trump had just entered the race. He was a punchline. He was a reality TV star turned political candidate that almost nobody in serious media was treating as a genuine threat. But Parker and Stone were not just making fun of him. They were also quietly terrified of what they were seeing, because they had seen this kind of thing before. They had spent years watching how quickly a crowd can turn. They had spent years watching how easily people get swept up in a performance, and they recognized something in Trump that they thought was worth putting in their show, not just as a joke, but as a warning. The episode also did something that almost nobody else was doing in 2015. It did not just mock Trump, it also looked at the people following him. Mr. Garrison's supporters in the episode are not stupid people. They are regular townspeople townspeople who are genuinely frustrated. They feel like their town is changing too fast. They feel like nobody is listening to them. And when someone comes along who speaks to those feelings loudly and without apology, they do not stop to think about whether that person is actually going to help them. They just feel heard, and that feeling is powerful enough to make them follow someone into very dark places. This is not something you saw a lot of in 2015. Most coverage of Trump supporters was dismissive. Most commentary treated his voters as a punchline. South Park did not do that. They took the dynamic seriously enough to build an entire episode around it. Now here's the part that makes this prediction even more remarkable. Parker and Stone were so confident Trump was not going to win that they spent most of season 20 building a storyline where Mr. Garrison, the Trump stand-in, was trying to lose the election on purpose. He was doing everything he could to get people to stop voting for him. And he kept winning anyway. It was meant to be absurd. It was meant to be the joke of the season. Then Trump actually won. Parker and Stone have spoken openly about what happened next. They had to throw out their entire season 20 finale and start over. The story they had written assumed Hillary Clinton would win. The episode they had planned did not make sense anymore. They had built a whole satirical arc around the idea that someone this outrageous could never actually become president of the United States. And then the United States proved them wrong. In one of the few moments where these two men were caught off guard by reality, Parker said that for the first time in the show's history, reality had actually outrun them. South Park had made a career out of being ahead of the culture, out of saying the thing everyone was thinking before anyone else said it. But on election night 2016, they found themselves sitting in their editing room watching the results come in and realizing that their fiction was not strange enough to keep up with the actual news. Think about that for a second. A show built entirely on predicting and satirizing the most extreme possible outcomes of human behavior had finally met something that outpaced it. But go back to that episode. Go back to September 23rd, 2015. Watch Mr. Garrison standing in front of that crowd in his red hat, screaming about building a wall, getting louder and louder as the crowd gets more and more excited. Watch the Canadian family explain that nobody thought their leader would ever really be in charge. Watch the episode build this entire picture of how a country convinces itself that a dangerous performance is just entertainment until it is too late. They did not just make a joke, they made a document. And when you understand that Parker and Stone wrote this in about 6 days while most of America was still laughing at the idea of Trump running for anything, it becomes one of the most unsettling things in the show's entire history. Not because they were psychic, not because they had some secret information, but because they were paying attention in a way that almost nobody else was. They looked at the energy in the room and they traced where it was going. They looked at the crowd, not just the candidate. They looked at what people were feeling, not just what they were saying. And they put all of that into a 22-minute cartoon that aired 13 months before everything they were describing actually happened. What makes this hit even harder is that the episode was not even their most famous political one. It was not the one people usually point to when they talk about South Park being bold. It was not a season finale. It was not a special. It was a regular Tuesday night episode in the second week of season 19. They wrote it, finished it, aired it, and moved on to the next one. That kind of calm, steady prescience, repeated season after season, week after week, is the thing that separates South Park from every other show on television. Most shows react to the news. South Park runs ahead of it. The Trump episode is proof, but it is far from the only one. __quote_3__. And if you think predicting the rise of one of the most controversial political figures in American history is impressive, wait until you hear what South Park managed to call about one of the most wanted men on the planet, 10 years before the rest of the world caught up. Section 2. They called Osama's death, Osama bin Laden has farty pants. Season 5, Episode 9, 2001. And It's a Jersey Thing. Season 14, Episode 9, 2010. There are predictions, and then there are predictions so specific that they stop feeling like coincidences. Most shows that have ever tried to do anything involving Osama bin Laden played it safe. They kept things vague, they avoided details. They understood that predicting the death of one of the most dangerous men in the world and getting the details right was not something you wanted to get wrong. The potential for embarrassment or worse was too high. South Park did not play it safe. South Park did it twice, and both times they got it right. Let us start from the very beginning of this story because the timing of the first episode alone is enough to make your jaw drop. On September 11th, 2001, the World Trade Center was attacked. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The United States was in a state of shock that is difficult difficult to fully describe to someone who did not live through it. The country was grieving, furious, scared, and deeply uncertain about what was going to happen next. Most television shows went quiet. Most comedies pulled their episodes. Late-night hosts sat at their desks and gave somber, tearful speeches. The general feeling across the entertainment world was that nothing funny should be broadcast for a long time, out of respect for what had just happened. South Park aired a new episode on November 7th, 2001, less than 2 months after the attacks. And that episode was called Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants. Now, you might think that sounds like a show being reckless. You might think that sounds like Parker and Stone just trying to shock people, which they sometimes do. But when you actually watch the episode, something more interesting is happening. The boys get accidentally shipped to Afghanistan in a care package. They end up face to face with bin Laden. And in the tradition of old Looney Tunes cartoons, Cartman runs circles around him, outsmarts him, and ultimately tricks him into a situation where American soldiers shoot him. At the end of the episode, bin Laden is dead, shot by Americans. That aired in November 2001. Bin Laden was not actually killed until May 2nd, 2011. That is almost exactly 10 years later. Now here is the part that takes this from interesting to genuinely remarkable. South Park did not just predict that bin Laden would be killed, they predicted how he would be killed. In the 2001 episode, after Cartman's Looney Tunes style tricks leave bin Laden confused and exposed, an American soldier fires the shot that finishes him off. He is killed by an American military operative with a gun in a targeted operation. In real life, on May 2nd, 2011, United States Navy SEALs raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan and killed Osama bin Laden. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head fired by an American military operative. The broad strokes are almost identical, but South Park was not done. They came back to this exact joke one more time in a season 14 episode called Quote 7, which aired in October 2010. The main plot of the episode is about the Jersey Shore reality show taking over America, which is its own kind of nightmare, and the town of South Park desperately trying to fight back against the invasion of loud, aggressive people from New Jersey. In the chaos, someone sends a videotape to bin Laden asking Al-Qaeda for help. Bin Laden shows up, and in the final moments involving his character, a special forces soldier drops from the ceiling and shoots him in the head. 7 months after that episode aired, bin Laden was killed in exactly the way South Park had shown. Think about what that means for a second. South Park ran this joke not once, but twice. And both times they ran it, they described an American military operative killing bin Laden with a gunshot. The first time they did it, they were working on raw instinct just weeks after the September 11th attacks, when the entire country was too grief-stricken to think clearly about anything. The second time they did it, they were so comfortable with the prediction that they treated it as a throwaway gag in an episode about Jersey Shore. They were so confident in how this was going to end that they made it a running joke. And here is something worth sitting with. The 2001 episode, Quote 8, was one of the most complicated things Parker and Stone had ever tried to do. They were not just trying to be funny, they were trying to help a country in pain find some way to breathe again. They understood that humor has always been one of the ways human beings deal with things that are too big and too terrible to process any other way. Cartman outsmarting bin Laden in a Looney Tunes cartoon was not disrespectful. It was, in a strange way, a form of comfort. It was saying out loud on television that this man was not untouchable, that he was not some all-powerful force, that he was, at the end of the day, a man who could be outsmarted and stopped. The episode also did something else that most American television was not doing at the time. It showed Afghan children, regular kids living in the middle of the conflict who had nothing to do with the attacks and were just trying to survive. The boys in South Park meet these kids and realize that the Afghan children are not so different from them. It was a moment of genuine humanity buried inside an absolutely absurd episode about bin Laden dying in a cartoon fight. That combination, the comedy and the compassion, is what makes South Park different. Anyone can make a loud, angry joke about a bad person. Very few people can make that joke while also quietly reminding the audience that war has costs beyond the obvious ones. But let us get back to the prediction itself, because there is one more layer to this that people often miss. In both episodes, bin Laden's death comes at the hands of an American soldier in a targeted, deliberate operation. He is not killed in an airstrike. He is not captured and put on trial. He is not taken out in some large-scale military confrontation. It is a small, direct, surgical operation where a soldier specifically goes after him and finishes the job with a single shot. That is almost exactly what happened in real life. The raid on bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad was not a massive military operation. It involved a small team of Navy SEALs operating quietly who went directly to where he was and killed him in a targeted strike. The whole thing was over in roughly 40 minutes. It was precise, it was deliberate, and it ended with a gunshot. South Park described this in a Looney Tunes cartoon in 2001. They described it again as a throwaway gag in 2010, and then real life caught up to the cartoon. Now, Parker and Stone have never claimed to have any special knowledge or inside information about anything. They are very open about their process. They write fast, they react to the world around them, and they trust their instincts about where things are going. What they are extraordinarily good at is looking at a situation and asking the most obvious question that everyone else is somehow avoiding. In the case of bin Laden, the obvious question was always, how does this end? And the obvious answer, even in November 2001, was that the United States was not going to stop until an American soldier found him and ended it. Most people in 2001 were not thinking about endings. They were too deep in the shock of what had just happened. But Parker and Stone were already looking at the full picture, asking where this story was going, and putting the conclusion on screen years before it happened. That is not psychic ability, that is clarity. That is the willingness to follow a thought all the way to its natural end without flinching, which is something South Park has always been better at than almost any other show on television. There is also something worth noting about the specific character Parker and Stone chose to deal with bin Laden. They gave Cartman the starring role in the confrontation, not Kyle, who is the moral center of the group, not Stan, who usually represents the voice of reason. Cartman, the most selfish, manipulative, unpredictable character in the whole show. And it works because Cartman does not play by the normal rules. He is not limited by ethics or fairness or concern for how things look. He just finds the weakness and exploits it. In choosing Cartman as the one to outsmart bin Laden, Parker and Stone were making a specific point about the nature of the conflict. Fighting this kind of threat, they were suggesting, was not going to be clean or noble or straightforward. It was going to require a different kind of thinking, a more ruthless, more flexible, less rule-bound approach. Whether you agree with that as a political statement or not is beside the point. The point is that they were working through these ideas in public, on television, in the form of a cartoon, while the rest of America was still trying to figure out what had just happened. And 10 years later, when the news broke that bin Laden had been found and killed in a targeted raid by a small team of American military operatives, people who remembered those South Park episodes had a very strange feeling. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. South Park had already shown them how this was going to go. Twice. The details, the method, the outcome, all of it was already there, sitting in 2 episodes of a cartoon that most people had long since moved past. Which raises a question that is worth thinking about. If a cartoon written in 6 days could trace this story to its conclusion that accurately, what does that say about the people who were telling us year after year that no one could have predicted what was coming? South Park predicted it, with a Looney Tunes fight and a Jersey Shore joke. __quote_9__. And if predicting the death of the world's most wanted man is not enough to convince you that this show operates on a completely different level than everything else on television, then wait until you hear about the time they predicted a cultural movement that would not exist for another 18 years, with a panda costume and a children's song. Section 3. The MeToo Avalanche. Quote 10. Season 3, Episode 6, 1999. Sometimes a prediction is not about a single event. Sometimes it is about a feeling, a shift in the air, a change in the way people talk to each other, treat each other, and hold each other accountable. Those kinds of predictions are actually harder to make than predicting a specific event, because they require you to understand not just what is happening right now, but where human behavior is slowly, quietly heading over the course of years and decades. South Park made one of those predictions on July 7th, 1999. The episode was called Quote 11, and when it aired, it was considered a funny, absurd, slightly uncomfortable episode about how people misuse legal systems and take good ideas too far. Critics noted it was sharp, fans thought it was hilarious, and then most people moved on because that is what you do with a cartoon episode. You watch it, you laugh, and you go to sleep. Nobody thought they were watching a document of something that would not fully arrive for another 18 years. Here is what happens in the episode. South Park Elementary is visited by a man in a panda costume. His name is Petey the Sexual Harassment Panda. Panda. He sings a little song for the kids about what counts as sexual harassment, what the rules are, and what they can do if someone makes them feel uncomfortable. It is the kind of school assembly presentation that schools in the late 1990s were genuinely beginning to run, where adults in costumes or with educational videos tried to teach children about serious topics in a way that was easy to understand. The kids listen to Petey's presentation, they take notes, and then they immediately start using everything they just learned as a weapon. Cartman calls Stan a name. Stan calls Cartman a name back. Someone decides this counts as sexual harassment. Cartman, with the help of Kyle's father Gerald, who acts as his lawyer, sues Stan for sexual harassment in court. Cartman exaggerates wildly on the stand. He performs distress. He makes the judge feel sorry for him. Stan has no money, so the court orders him to give Cartman 50% of his toys. Gerald, who is a lawyer, quickly realizes there is an enormous amount of money to be made here. He starts convincing other children to sue each other. The school board gets sued, teachers get sued, parents get sued. Within a very short amount of time, the entire town of South Park is drowning in sexual harassment lawsuits. The school is going bankrupt. Nobody can talk to anybody without worrying that something they say is going to end up in court. The whole thing spirals into a case called Everyone versus Everyone, where Gerald is simultaneously representing all parties on both sides of every lawsuit, somehow legally, and collecting fees from everybody involved. The episode is funny. It is also very precise, because what Parker and Stone were describing in 1999 was not just a silly cartoon situation. They were describing a specific kind of cultural overcorrection. They were describing what happens when a genuine and important idea, in this case the idea that people should not be harassed and that there should be consequences for bad behavior, gets taken and twisted by people who are more interested in winning than in justice. They were describing a world where the rules designed to protect people become tools that anyone can pick up and swing in any direction, regardless of whether the situation actually calls for it. They were describing, in a children's panda costume, the exact mechanism that would drive enormous parts of the public conversation starting in 2017. Now let us be very careful and very fair about what is being said here. The real MeToo movement, which went worldwide in October 2017 following reporting on Harvey Weinstein, was responding to genuine, serious, documented abuse that had been happening for decades. The women and men who came forward had real stories about real harm. That is not in question, and it is not what South Park was predicting or mocking in this episode. What South Park was predicting was something different. They were predicting the cultural atmosphere that would surround a movement like that. The way the energy of a genuine reckoning can, over time, start to include cases that are far less clear. The way accusation can become its own kind of currency. The way that lawyers and institutions and individuals can use the language of justice in ways that have very little to do with actual justice. The way that everyone becomes afraid to speak, afraid to be in the same room, afraid that something completely innocent is going to be reframed as something horrible. That specific atmosphere, the one the episode was describing, became very real between 2017 and the early 2020s. And the episode called it in 1999. The phrase "Me Too" was first used publicly in 2006 by activist Tarana Burke, who created it as a way to help survivors of sexual violence feel less alone. The hashtag did not go worldwide until October 2017, 18 years after South Park's Panda episode aired. The movement that followed was one of the biggest cultural shifts of the decade. Dozens of powerful men in entertainment, media, politics, and business lost their careers, their reputations, and in some cases, their freedom. It was a genuine and overdue reckoning with behavior that had been ignored and hidden for far too long. But alongside the real cases, a conversation also emerged about where the lines were, about due process, about the difference between a criminal act and a rude comment, about whether the speed and intensity of public judgment was always fair or accurate, about whether the fear of being accused had become so powerful that it was changing the way people interacted with each other in workplaces and schools and public spaces in ways that went far beyond the original intention of the movement. That exact conversation, right down to the lawsuits and the lawyers profiting from the chaos, was what South Park put on screen in 1999. There is a specific moment in the episode that hits particularly hard when you watch it now. Gerald the lawyer is not a villain in the traditional sense. He is not twisting the law out of cruelty or malice. He is doing it because the opportunity is there and because the system allows it and because money is money. He looks around, sees a situation where everyone is vulnerable, and figures out how to position himself to profit from that vulnerability. He is not the cause of the problem. He is the symptom of it. And that portrait of a well-meaning system being monetized and distorted by people who are technically following the rules while completely missing the point is something that showed up again and again in real-world conversations about the legal and cultural machinery surrounding high-profile harassment cases. Parker and Stone also made a choice in this episode that shows how carefully they were thinking about it. They did not make the original idea of the panda visit wrong. Petey the sexual harassment panda is not the villain. The concept of teaching kids about harassment and consent and appropriate behavior is not the problem. The problem is what happens after. The problem is the gap between the lesson and how it gets used. The problem is human nature meeting a new set of rules and immediately figuring out how to exploit them. That distinction is important. South Park was not saying that sexual harassment is not real or that people should not be protected from it. They were saying that any system created to address a real problem will almost immediately be discovered by people who want to use it for their own purposes. And that once that starts happening, the people it was designed to protect often end up getting lost in the noise. That is a very mature and very uncomfortable idea to put in a cartoon about a man in a panda suit, but that is exactly what Parker and Stone did. There is also something worth noting about when this episode aired. The late 1990s were a time when workplace sensitivity training, harassment policies, and HR departments were becoming a much bigger part of everyday life across America. Companies were rolling out new guidelines, schools were running new programs. There was a genuine and growing effort to codify rules around behavior that had previously been left to individual judgment. And along with that effort came all the things that always come when you try to turn human behavior into a set of formal rules. Confusion, overreach, people gaming the system, bureaucracy replacing common sense. South Park was watching all of that happen in 1999 and tracing where it was going. The episode ends in a way that is both funny and genuinely thoughtful. The boys track down Petey the sexual harassment panda, who has lost his job because the school, drowning in legal bills, cut the program that employed him. They help him find a new purpose, as a mascot for a different kind of idea entirely. It is a quiet, almost gentle ending for an episode that spent most of its runtime being loud and chaotic. But what lingers is not the ending. What lingers is the middle of the episode. The part where Gerald is filing lawsuits on behalf of everyone against everyone. The part where Cartman is performing distress in court to win money from a situation that had nothing to do with actual harm. The part where the school is going broke trying to manage accusations that started because a kid called another kid a name. When people who remember this episode watch it now, in the context of everything that happened in the decade after 2017, there is a very specific feeling that comes up. It is not quite shock. It is not quite amusement. It is something closer to the feeling you get when you find an old journal entry that described something important before you understood why it was important. South Park wrote that journal entry in July 1999. The full meaning of it took 18 years to show up. And what makes this particular prediction so much more unsettling than some of the others is how ordinary it all seems in the episode. There is no big dramatic moment. There is no single villain to point to. There is just a panda, a song, a lawyer who sees an opportunity, and a town that slowly loses its mind trying to navigate a system it created for good reasons, but could not control once it was running. That is exactly how these things happen in real life. Not with a single loud crash, with a slow, steady slide that nobody notices until it is already too late to stop. South Park noticed in 1999 with a panda costume and a children's song. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while one prediction about human behavior is impressive and two starts to feel like a pattern, wait until you hear about the time South Park looked at a single American state and correctly mapped out the future of an entire nationwide debate. Two full years before the law even changed. Section 4. Weed was already legal in South Park. Medicinal fried chicken. Season 14, Episode 3, 2010. There is a specific kind of prediction that is easy to dismiss in the moment and impossible to ignore in hindsight. It is not the kind where someone says a famous person is going to fall from grace, or a war is going to start, or a natural disaster is going to happen. Those are big dramatic predictions about big dramatic events, the kind that get written about and talked about and turned into YouTube videos. The harder kind of prediction is when someone looks at the direction a society is slowly moving and says out loud before anyone is ready to hear it, this is where you are going. This is what your future looks like. Not eventually, soon. On March 31st, 2010, South Park made that kind of prediction about marijuana in America. And they did it not with a serious documentary or a think piece or a political speech. They did it with a cartoon about a man microwaving his own body parts to get high. The episode was called Medicinal Fried Chicken, and from the very first scene, it is doing something more than just being funny. The episode opens with the boys arriving at their local KFC, which is one of Cartman's most sacred places in the world. Cartman loves KFC with an intensity that the show has always played as both a joke and a genuine character trait. It is not just food to him, it is comfort, it is identity. It is the one thing in his life that reliably makes him happy. So when the boys pull up and find that the KFC has been replaced by a medical marijuana dispensary, Cartman does not just get upset, he enters a state of complete crisis. The reason for the closure is a new law that bans fast food restaurants from operating in low-income areas of Colorado. Because KFC was only located in those areas across the whole state, every single KFC in Colorado has been shut down simultaneously. Cartman, faced with the loss of the thing he loves most, immediately begins building a black market operation to smuggle KFC into Colorado from neighboring states. The episode follows his rise as a fried chicken crime lord, directly mirroring the plot of the movie Scarface, as he builds a smuggling network, gets in over his head, and watches the whole thing collapse. That storyline is funny and creative and everything you would expect from South Park. But the other storyline in the episode is the one that matters for this section. Because while Cartman is becoming a fried chicken drug lord, Randy Marsh is doing something that tells you everything about where America was heading. Randy finds out that the new dispensary near his house sells marijuana legally, but only to people who have a doctor's note confirming a medical condition. Randy does not have a medical condition. Randy is a healthy adult who simply wants to get high. So Randy, being Randy, decides to give himself a medical condition. He tries tanning too long to get skin cancer. He smokes constantly, he gets x-rays, he researches every possible way to make himself genuinely sick enough to qualify for a legal marijuana prescription. Eventually, he discovers that testicular cancer can be caused by extreme radiation exposure. He puts his body in front of a microwave. His body swells to a grotesque and absurd size. He goes to the doctor confirms cancer. Randy gets his marijuana card and immediately goes to buy marijuana, smoking it openly on the street in front of police officers who cannot stop him because it is completely legal. Now, here's why all of this matters beyond just being a very strange and very funny cartoon. When this episode aired on March 31st, 2010, recreational marijuana was illegal everywhere in the United States. Every single state. Colorado had a medical marijuana law at the time, which allowed patients to get cards to buy marijuana legally if they had a qualifying condition. But the system was, as the episode was directly pointing out, already being abused on a massive scale. As of March 2010, an average of 1,000 people per day were applying for medical marijuana cards in Colorado, and state officials were openly concerned that the vast majority of those applications had nothing to do with genuine medical need. People were doing, in slightly less extreme fashion, exactly what Randy was doing. They were finding ways to qualify for cards they wanted for recreational reasons. They were treating the medical system as a technicality to get around, rather than a genuine medical protection. The gap between what the law was designed to do and what people were actually using it for was already enormous. South Park looked at that gap and drew the obvious conclusion. If this many people are willing to jump through all these hoops to get marijuana legally, and the whole medical justification is already basically a formality for most of them, then the next logical step is simply making it legal for everyone and dropping the pretense. That is the argument the dispensary owner makes inside the episode. When politicians gather to discuss the situation and debate whether to tighten the medical marijuana rules, the dispensary owner stands up and suggests the simplest possible solution. Just legalize it. People are abusing the medical system anyway. The system is not doing what it was designed to do. So stop pretending it is a medical issue and just treat it like what it actually is, which is something a large large number of adults want to do recreationally and are going to do regardless of what the law says. That argument, delivered in a cartoon in March 2010, became the dominant argument in Colorado's real political debate over the following 2 years. In November 2012, Colorado voted to legalize recreational marijuana, becoming the second state in the United States to do so after Washington. Full legal sales began in January 2014. 2 years after South Park predicted it, the state that the show is set in made the exact move the show said it was inevitably going to make. And it did not stop there. State after state followed. The conversation that South Park was having in a cartoon in 2010 became the conversation that actual lawmakers were having in actual chambers across the country for the entire decade that followed. But the episode is doing something even more precise than just predicting legalization. It is predicting the specific shape of the debate that would surround legalization. The black market storyline with Cartman is not just there for laughs. It is making a very specific point about what happens when you ban something that a large number of people want. When KFC gets made illegal in the episode, it does not disappear. It just goes underground. It becomes more expensive. It becomes controlled by people who are willing to operate outside the law. The violence and chaos that surrounds the KFC black market in the episode directly mirrors the violence and chaos that surrounds any real-world black market for any prohibited substance. The episode is saying, as clearly as a cartoon can say anything, that prohibition does not make things go away. It just makes them more dangerous and more profitable for the wrong people. That argument, applied to marijuana specifically, became central to the real-world legalization debates that followed the episode. Advocates for legalization argued repeatedly that keeping marijuana illegal was not reducing its use. It was just ensuring that the money from it went to criminal networks rather than to legal businesses and tax revenue. It was the exact argument buried inside Cartman's KFC smuggling operation. There's also something worth paying attention to in the way the episode handles Randy specifically. Randy is not shown as a bad person for wanting marijuana. He is not shown as a criminal or a failure. He is shown as a basically normal adult who wants something that is technically legal in a limited way, and who is willing to go to absurd lengths to access it because the legal pathway is so unnecessarily complicated and humiliating. The satire is aimed at the system, not at him. The episode is not saying that people who want marijuana are wrong. It is saying that a law which makes a basically harmless activity so difficult to access legally that people are willing to give themselves cancer to comply with the rules is a law that has lost touch with common sense. That is a bold position to take in a cartoon in 2010. Mainstream political opinion had not caught up to that position yet. Legalization was still considered a fringe idea by most politicians. Polling was shifting, but had not yet reached the point where either major party was willing to openly support it. The idea that a state would simply vote to make recreational marijuana legal was considered by most people in the political mainstream to be an unlikely and distant possibility. South Park treated it as the obvious next step, 2 years before it happened. There is one more detail in this episode that deserves attention, because it speaks to how carefully Parker and Stone were watching the real world when they wrote it. The concept of a former KFC restaurant being converted into a marijuana dispensary was not invented for the episode. It was based on a real thing that had already happened. A real marijuana dispensary in Palms, Los Angeles had opened inside a building that used to be a Kentucky Fried Chicken location, and it even named itself using the initials KFC as a joke. Parker and Stone saw that story, understood what it meant about the direction things were heading, and built an entire episode around the logic it contained. That is the South Park method in its purest form. They did not invent the future. They found it hiding in a small, strange, real-world story that most people glanced at and forgot. And they followed that story all the way to its conclusion, which turned out to be the conclusion that Colorado, and then the rest of the country, eventually arrived at on their own. Randy's enormous radiation-caused medical condition is one of the most absurd images in the show's long history. But underneath the absurdity is something that holds up completely. A man who wants something legal enough to do anything to get it, in a state that is clearly heading toward making it fully legal in a country that is slowly and awkwardly moving in the same direction. South Park drew that map in 2010. The country spent the next decade following it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if you think predicting the legalization of marijuana 2 years before it happened is a remarkable feat for a cartoon, then you are absolutely right. But it is still not the most unsettling prediction on this list, because while South Park was busy mapping out the future of drug policy, they were also quietly, almost casually, predicting a technological revolution that would turn ordinary people into surveillance operators and change the nature of privacy forever, with a single episode about drones. Section 5, Drone Warfare Goes Civilian, The Magic Bush, Season 18, Episode 4, 2014. There are moments in South Park's history where the show does not just predict one thing, it predicts an entire world. Not a single event, not a single person's downfall, not a single law changing in a single state, an entire world. A set of conditions that did not fully exist yet, but were clearly being assembled piece by piece just below the surface of everyday life. A world where technology that used to belong only to governments and militaries slowly trickles down into the hands of ordinary people, and where that trickle changes everything about how people live, how they watch each other, how they fight each other, and how the people in charge respond. South Park built that entire world inside a single episode in 2014, and within a few years, most of it had arrived in real life. The episode was called The Magic Bush. It aired on October 29, 2014, and to understand why it matters, you need to understand what the world looked like when it was made. In 2014, consumer drones were just beginning to exist in a serious way. The technology had been around for years in military settings, where large, expensive, remotely operated aircraft were used for surveillance and strikes in conflict zones overseas. But the idea of an ordinary person buying a drone at a store, taking it home and flying it around their neighborhood was still relatively new. The market for consumer drones was growing fast, but it was still seen mostly as a hobby thing, an expensive toy for enthusiasts, something you might see at a tech fair or read about in a gadget magazine, but not something that had become a genuine social issue yet. The conversation about what drones would mean for privacy, for policing, for civil liberties, for the relationship between citizens and their governments had barely started. Most people were not thinking about any of that. They were thinking about how cool it was that you could buy a little flying camera. South Park was already thinking about what came next. The episode begins with Cartman's neighbor, Craig's father, buying a drone. He uses it to fly it over the neighborhood, and in the process, accidentally captures footage of a woman in a private moment that she had every reason to believe was not being recorded. The footage spreads. People are embarrassed and outraged. The neighborhood erupts in arguments about privacy, about who has the right to fly cameras over whose property, about what counts as an invasion of someone's personal space when the camera doing the invading is hovering 40 feet in the air and belongs to your neighbor. That specific conflict, the one between a person with a consumer drone and a neighbor who does not want to be filmed, was not a major news story when the episode aired. It became one within the next 2 years. As drones became cheaper and more available, incidents exactly like the one in the episode started happening regularly across the United States. People were filming their neighbors from above. People were flying drones over private property. Courts began dealing with cases about airspace rights and privacy laws that had never been written to account for flying cameras owned by civilians. The conversation that South Park started in a cartoon in 2014 became a genuine legal and social debate within a very short period of time. But the episode does not stop there. It keeps going, and the further it goes, the more it predicts. After the neighborhood gets upset about Craig's father's drone, other people in South Park start buying their own drones. They begin using their drones to spy on Craig's father's drone, to watch the watcher, to gather evidence on the person they consider a threat. Within a short period of time, the entire neighborhood is filled with drones. Everyone is watching everyone. Cameras are everywhere in the sky. The air above South Park has become a battlefield of competing surveillance devices, each one launched by someone who believes they are the reasonable one, each one contributing to a situation that is spiraling completely out of control. This is one of the most accurate pictures South Park has ever painted of how technology actually spreads through a community. It does not spread because everyone thinks it is a good idea. It spreads because once one person has a tool that gives them an advantage, everyone around them feels pressure to get the same tool, whether they want it or not. The neighborhood in the episode does not want to be a surveillance zone. They end up in one anyway because the logic of the situation pushes them there. That exact dynamic, where consumer drones spread through communities in ways that created new social tensions and new conflicts and new questions that nobody had the rules to answer yet, played out in real neighborhoods across the world in the years after this episode aired. Then the police show up, and this is where the episode moves from being a sharp observation about consumer technology into something more genuinely unsettling. When the civilian drone situation in South Park gets out of hand, the police respond by deploying their own drones. Police drones now join the civilian drones in the sky above the neighborhood. They are larger, they are more powerful, they are there to manage the situation, but their presence immediately makes the situation feel more serious and more threatening to the people who live there. The community, which was already upset about being watched by their neighbors, is now also being watched from above by law enforcement. The skies that were once just the skies are now full of machines with cameras, and nobody asked anyone if this was okay. When the police drones are not enough, the episode escalates further. National Guard drones appear. Military-grade surveillance is now operating over a residential neighborhood because a man bought a consumer drone to spy on his neighbor. The situation has grown through a completely logical chain of escalations, from a privacy dispute between two neighbors into a full-scale aerial surveillance operation involving multiple levels of government. Each step in that chain makes sense given the step before it. That is what makes it so effective as satire and so accurate as prediction. South Park was not describing something random, it was describing a pattern. The same pattern that shows up anytime a new surveillance technology enters civilian life. First, the civilians get it, then there is conflict, then the police get involved with their own version of the same technology, then the government gets involved. And by the end, something that started as a neighborhood argument has become a much bigger conversation about power, control, and who gets to watch whom. That conversation arrived in real life faster than almost anyone expected. In 2018, at the Winter Olympics in South Korea, the South Korean government officially deployed security drones to intercept and take down civilian-operated drones that were violating restricted airspace over the Olympic venues. This was the first major international event where drone-on-drone enforcement, security drones chasing civilian drones, became a publicly known and discussed reality. The specific scenario of government drones being used to combat civilian drones, which South Park had played as an escalating absurdity in 2014, had become actual government policy by 2018. By the early 2020s, police departments across the United States were regularly using drones for surveillance during protests and public gatherings. The debate about whether this was appropriate, whether it was a violation of civil liberties, whether the public had any say in whether their neighborhoods could be watched from above by law enforcement, became one of the central civil rights conversations of the decade. South Park drew the map for all of it in one episode in 2014. What makes the episode particularly impressive is the way it handles the emotional reality of living in a surveillance environment. It is not just a political argument, it is about how it feels. The people in South Park do not feel safer because there are more drones watching over them. They feel more anxious, more watched, more like they are suspects in their own neighborhood. The technology that was supposed to make things better has instead created a constant low-level tension that nobody knows how to resolve because the rules for resolving it do not exist yet. That emotional reality, the feeling of living in a space where you can never be fully sure you are not being watched from above, became a genuine part of everyday life for people in cities across the world as drone technology matured. It is a strange and specific feeling that is very hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. And South Park captured it perfectly in a cartoon about a neighborhood argument over a flying camera. There is also a detail in the episode that is easy to miss but worth paying attention to. The original drone operator, Craig's father, does not see himself as someone doing anything wrong. He bought a drone, he flew it, he did not think about what he might capture or what the consequences might be. He was just enjoying his new toy. He was not malicious. He was not a bad person trying to hurt anyone. He was just someone with access to a new technology who did not think carefully about what that technology could do in the wrong moment. That portrait of accidental harm caused by thoughtless technology use is one of the most honest things the episode contains. Most of the real-world drone controversies that followed were not caused by people with bad intentions. They were caused by people with new toys and no real framework for thinking about the consequences of using them in shared spaces. The harm that came from those situations was real, even when the intent was not harmful at all. South Park understood that in 2014. The legal systems and community standards that tried to deal with it were still years behind. By the time the rules started catching up, the sky above neighborhoods across the world already looked a lot like the sky above South Park in that episode, full of competing cameras, full of competing interests, full of the slow, uncomfortable realization that a technology that seemed like fun had quietly changed something fundamental about how people shared space with each other. All of this, the civilian drones, the police drones, the government escalation, the privacy debates, the emotional weight of constant surveillance, was sitting inside a cartoon episode in 2014, waiting for the world to arrive at the place South Park had already described. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And as remarkable as it is that South Park could map the entire arc of civilian drone culture before it happened, it is somehow even more remarkable that around the same time, they were also quietly predicting the downfall of one of the most recognized faces in American fast food advertising. A man who thought being on a popular cartoon was the greatest compliment he had ever received. Section 6, the Jared Fogle warning. Jared has AIDS. Season 6, Episode 1, 2002. Some predictions are dramatic, some are political, some are about technology or culture or the direction a country is heading. And then there are the ones that are deeply uncomfortable. The ones that when you look back at them do not feel like clever satirical observations about the world. They feel like warnings that nobody took seriously because the warning was wrapped inside a joke, and the joke was too funny for anyone to look at what was underneath it. The story of South Park and Jared Fogle is that kind of prediction, and it is one of the most unsettling things this show has ever accidentally gotten right. To understand it fully, you need to know who Jared Fogle was and why he was famous. In the late 1990s, a college student from Indiana named Jared Fogle lost a significant amount of weight. He lost it, according to the story he told publicly, by switching his diet to Subway sandwiches. He ate 2 Subway sandwiches a day, walked more, and over the course of about a year, transformed his body dramatically. A local newspaper wrote about it. A magazine picked up the story. And then Subway, the sandwich chain, hired him to appear in their commercials. For roughly 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, Jared Fogle was one of the most recognizable advertising figures in America. He appeared in over 300 Subway commercials. His face and his story were everywhere. He was the friendly, relatable, real person success story that Subway built a large part of their brand around. When people thought of Subway, they thought of Jared. He was considered a genuinely positive figure, a regular person who had done something admirable and was now helping a company sell sandwiches. Harmless, wholesome, familiar. South Park made an episode about him in 2002. The episode was called Jared Has AIDS, and it aired on March 6th, 2002. In the episode, Jared comes to South Park to promote his weight loss story. The boys get access to him and find out that his real secret was not just the sandwiches. He had help from personal assistants, people he called his aides, who helped him with his diet and exercise routine. He had been letting Subway imply that the sandwiches alone were responsible for the transformation, which was not entirely honest. When Jared decides to come clean and tells the public that he had AIDS helping him, a series of miscommunications turned the word AIDS into the word AIDS, the disease, and the entire town erupts in chaos. Everyone thinks Jared has been telling people he lost weight by getting a terrible illness. Subway fires him. His girlfriend leaves him. The town turns on him. He nearly gets lynched before the misunderstanding is cleared up. The episode is a wordplay comedy. It is built almost entirely on one joke. It is considered one of the sillier episodes of season 6. The real Jared Fogle was interviewed about it in 2003, and he said he had no problem with the episode at all. He called it typical South Park humor and said he found it flattering that the show had devoted an entire episode to him. He added, and this line becomes deeply uncomfortable in hindsight, that you know you have made it when South Park starts making fun of you. He said this in 2003. 12 years later, in 2015, the FBI opened an investigation into Jared Fogle. What emerged from that investigation was not a misunderstanding. It was not a wordplay joke. It was a serious, documented, deeply disturbing set of criminal acts. Fogle was charged with, and pleaded guilty to, child sex tourism and possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to 15 years and 8 months in federal prison. Subway immediately ended their relationship with him. His name, which had been synonymous with a wholesome diet success story for 15 years, became synonymous with something entirely different overnight. The company he had represented for a decade and a half was left trying to recover from the association. Now go back to the 2002 episode. In the episode, South Park depicts Jared as someone who destroys Subway's reputation through a misunderstanding about what he has been hiding. The show depicts him as someone who was not entirely honest about how he achieved his success. The show depicts his relationship with Subway ending in scandal, with him being fired and the company distancing itself from him as fast as possible. All of that happened in real life 13 years later, for reasons far more serious than the ones in the episode. But here is the part that makes this prediction truly remarkable and truly dark. Parker and Stone did not stop with the 2002 episode. They kept coming back to Jared Fogle as a character. He appeared again in a season 10 episode. He appeared in the season 14 episode __quote_22__, where he was depicted alongside other celebrities who were upset with South Park for mocking them. And then in season 19, in an episode called __quote_23__ that aired in September 2015, just weeks after Fogle's arrest had become public news, South Park brought him back one more time. In this appearance, Fogle is shown at a party, moving through a crowd, trying to get close to Syrian refugee children. The show was now depicting him explicitly and directly as someone who targeted children, because by that point, that is what the real-world evidence said he was. What the show had been doing for years without anyone fully recognizing it was moving Jared Fogle's character in a specific direction. The 2002 episode had him hiding something about his true self and having it blow up publicly in a way that destroyed his relationship with Subway. Each subsequent appearance moved him slightly further from the harmless sandwich spokesman image. By the time his real crimes became public knowledge in 2015, South Park had already been treating his character as someone with hidden darkness for over a decade. Whether that was deliberate prescience or just a reflection of the uncomfortable energy that surrounded Fogle's public persona is something only Parker and Stone could answer. But the result is one of the most unsettling through lines in the show's history. A character who was introduced as a vehicle for a wordplay joke about the difference between AIDS and AIDS, and who gradually transformed across multiple appearances over 13 years into a direct depiction of a predator. There is something specific about the 2002 episode that becomes very hard to watch once you know what happened in 2015. In it, Jared is shown as someone who maintained a carefully constructed public image that did not match the private reality. He presented one version of himself to the world, the friendly, successful, relatable sandwich guy, while the truth of how he operated was different. The episode played this as a light comedy about a diet secret, but the structure of it, the gap between the public face and the private truth, the way the wholesome corporate image covered something that would not survive scrutiny, turned out to be a very accurate picture of how Fogle had actually been living for years. The real Fogle spent 15 years as one of the most recognized and trusted advertising figures in America. He attended events, he met fans, he represented a major company, and the entire time, according to the evidence that came out in 2015, he was also living a private life that bore no resemblance to the image he was selling. South Park put a version of that gap on screen in 2002. They made it a joke about word confusion, but the underlying observation that Jared Fogle was someone who was hiding what was actually driving his success and his lifestyle aged into something very dark very quickly once the real story became known. The reaction among South Park fans when Fogle's arrest became public was a specific kind of uncomfortable recognition. People went back and watched Jared Has AIDS and found it almost impossible to laugh at the same moments that had been funny in 2002. Not because the jokes had gotten worse, because the context had changed everything. A story about hidden AIDS and public embarrassment, and a man whose reputation collapses when his true self is revealed, was now sitting on top of something genuinely terrible. That is the strange and heavy feeling that comes with this particular South Park prediction. The other ones on this list, Trump, bin Laden, marijuana legalization, the MeToo movement, they are uncomfortable in a political or cultural way. They make you think about society and power and how things change. This one is uncomfortable in a more personal way. It involves a real person, a real crime, real victims, and a cartoon that had been circling the truth of that person for over a decade before the truth became undeniable. Parker and Stone have always been upfront about the fact that they write from instinct. They react to what they see. They follow the threads that seem interesting or uncomfortable or funny. And something about Jared Fogle from the very first episode they made about him clearly struck them as interesting enough to keep returning to. Something about the gap between his public image and the reality behind it was compelling enough that they kept writing him back into the show and kept pushing his character further into darker territory across 13 years of episodes. By the time the real world caught up to where South Park had been going with him all along, it did not feel like a coincidence. It felt like the show had been trying to tell everyone something for a long time in the only language it knows how to use, which is the language of absurdist comedy and outrageous satire. The warning was always there. It was just wrapped so thoroughly in a joke about word confusion and a wordplay gag about a diet sandwich that most people never looked at what was underneath it until they had to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And as dark as this particular story is, the next prediction on this list takes things in a completely different direction. Because while South Park was quietly tracking the truth about one of America's most trusted advertising faces, they were also, all the way back in 1999, describing a technology company secretly using children's games to gather their personal information and track their every move. A prediction so accurate that when the technology it described finally arrived 17 years later, the show's creators told the world they had already done it. Section 7. Pokemon Go existed in 1999, quote 26, Season 3, Episode 11, 1999. Every now and then, a prediction is so specific, so detailed, and so far ahead of its time that even the people who made it cannot quite believe how accurate it turned out to be. This is one of those times. On November 3rd, 1999, South Park aired an episode called quote underscore 27 underscore. On the surface, it was a parody of the Pokemon craze that was sweeping through schools and living rooms across America at the time. Kids were collecting the cards, kids were watching the cartoon, kids were playing the video games. The whole thing had become one of those unstoppable cultural waves that adults could not fully understand and children could not get enough of. It was loud, it was everywhere, and it was making an enormous amount of money for the Japanese company behind it. South Park looked at the Pokemon craze and did what South Park always does. They took the surface level thing and asked what was underneath it. They looked at the game and the cards and the cartoon and the merchandise and asked the question that nobody else was asking. What if there was something else going on here? What if the fun was not the point? What if the fun was just the delivery system for something else entirely? The answer they came up with in 1999 became one of the most accurate predictions the show has ever made. Not because a Japanese company was actually using Pokemon to brainwash children, which was the absurdist premise of the episode, but because the specific mechanism the episode described, a game that uses entertainment to get people moving around in the real world while secretly collecting their location data, became a literal reality 17 years later. In the episode, the Pokemon toys and games contain hidden computer chips. These chips track where the children go, what they do, and where they are at any given moment. The information is being sent back to Japan. The games are designed to get children so obsessed with collecting and playing that they will go anywhere and do anything in pursuit of the next creature or the next level. The children of South Park stop paying attention to their families, their schoolwork, and their surroundings. They follow wherever the game leads them. They go to places they would not normally go. They do things they would not normally do. They are so locked into the experience of playing that they have essentially handed control of their movements over to the people who designed the game. That is the premise of a cartoon that aired in November 1999. In July 2016, Nintendo released Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go was an app for smartphones that used real-world locations as the playing field. Players had to physically walk around their neighborhoods, their cities, and sometimes places they had never been before in order to find and catch virtual creatures that appeared on their phone screens as if they were overlaid on the real world. The game used the player's actual GPS location at all times. It knew where you were. It tracked your movements. It sent that information back to the servers of the company that made it, and it was so compelling, so perfectly designed to trigger the same collecting and completing instincts that had made the original Pokemon game so addictive that within days of its release, it had become the biggest mobile game in history. People were going everywhere, into parks, into neighborhoods they did not live in, into restricted areas, onto private property, into situations that were occasionally dangerous because they were so focused on what was on their phone screen that they stopped paying attention to what was around them in the real world. The game had gotten people to hand over their location data, their movement patterns, and enormous amounts of their time and attention in exchange for the experience of catching cartoon creatures. 17 years earlier, South Park had described exactly this in a cartoon about a fake Japanese game called Pokemon. When Pokemon Go launched in July 2016 and the whole world went into a frenzy over it, journalists and fans started connecting it back to the Pokemon episode almost immediately. The comparison was obvious once you saw it. A Japanese game. Kids going to real locations in the real world to collect creatures. Location tracking built into the experience. People wandering into places they would not normally go because the game was leading them there. Parker and Stone were asked about it directly. They were at San Diego Comic-Con in July 2016, just days after Pokemon Go had launched, and the question came up almost immediately. Had they predicted Pokemon Go? Did they see this coming back in 1999? Trey Parker's response was immediate and completely straight-faced. He said, "We did, in 1999. Matt Stone laughed and said the app had ripped off their thing. Parker joked that they were going to sue Nintendo for stealing their idea. The whole exchange was light and funny, the way Parker and Stone usually handle these moments. But underneath the jokes was something real. They had described the core mechanism of Pokemon Go, a game that uses entertainment to get people moving through real-world locations while collecting their data, 17 years before it existed. And the location tracking element of the episode is worth paying specific attention to, because it was not just a throwaway detail, it was central to the plot. In the Chinpokomon episode, the parents figure out that something is wrong when they start noticing the chip technology inside the toys. The whole reason the Japanese company behind Chinpokomon is doing this is to gather intelligence, to know where American children are and what they are doing as part of a larger plan. The data collection is not accidental, it is the entire point. The fun is just what gets people to participate without asking questions. Now, the real Pokemon Go was not designed as a military intelligence operation. Nintendo and Niantic, the company that made the app, were not trying to gather data to use against anyone. But the concerns that people raised when the app launched were genuinely similar to the concerns the parents in the Chinpokomon episode were raising. People worried about what data was being collected. People worried about who had access to it. People worried about children going to unfamiliar or unsafe locations because the app was directing them there. There were real incidents of people being lured to dangerous situations by players who had set up the game's location markers at isolated spots. The episode had named all of these concerns in 1999, not as hypotheticals, as the central plot of the story. There is also something in the episode about the way the Chinpokomon craze spreads that maps very accurately onto how Pokemon Go spread in real life. In the episode, the children do not start playing because they think it is a good idea. They start playing because everyone else is playing. Kyle initially does not want anything to do with Chinpokomon. His father even gives him a speech about individuality and not following the crowd. Kyle listens to the speech, considers it for about 3 seconds, and then points out the simple reality. He can either have a Chinpokomon or he can be the only kid without one, which will mean being left out and made fun of. His father thinks about it and gives him $10. That exchange is one of the funniest and most honest moments in the episode, and it also describes exactly how Pokemon Go spread in the summer of 2016. People did not download it because they had spent time evaluating whether it was a good use of their time. They downloaded it because everyone around them was playing it and they did not want to be left out of the conversation. The social pressure to participate was enormous, and it operated in exactly the way the Chinpokomon episode described. Not through advertising or persuasion, but through the simple human fear of being the only one not doing the thing everyone else is doing. The episode also touches on something that became a very real concern when Pokemon Go launched. The game's design, the fact that it required players to actually go to physical locations in the real world, meant that players were sometimes going to places that were not safe, appropriate, or legal. In the Chinpokomon episode, the children end up at a training camp, going far from home, following wherever the game leads them, without their parents having any real idea of where they are or what they are doing. The game had essentially taken control of their movements. When Pokemon Go launched, authorities in multiple countries issued warnings about exactly this. Players were trespassing, players were walking into traffic, players were going to cemeteries, private properties, and restricted areas because the game had placed virtual creatures there. In one widely reported incident, players were being lured to isolated locations by other players who had set up situations designed to take advantage of people whose attention was entirely on their phone screens. The game was directing people's physical movements in the real world, and not everyone who was taking advantage of that was doing so with good intentions. South Park had described all of this in 1999 as the sinister master plan of a cartoon Japanese company. The real version in 2016 was less sinister and more chaotic, but the mechanism was identical. What makes the Chinpokomon prediction stand apart from some of the others on this list is the sheer amount of time between the episode and the thing it predicted. 17 years. In 1999, smartphones did not exist in any meaningful way. The idea of a game that used GPS to track your real-world location and overlay digital creatures onto the physical environment you were standing in was not just unusual, It was technically impossible with the tools that existed at the time. Parker and Stone were describing a technology that had not been invented yet, in the context of a joke about Pokemon cards. And yet every core element of what they described, the location tracking, the real-world movement, the data being collected and sent back to the company, the social pressure that made people participate regardless of whether it seemed safe or sensible, was present in the Chin Pokemon episode over 15 years before the technology existed to make it real. The creators themselves acknowledged it. Parker said they did it in 1999. Stone said the real app ripped off their thing. They were joking, but they were also right. The episode is sitting there on the record from November 1999, describing the essential shape of a technology that would not arrive until 2016. That is the kind of prediction that stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something else, something harder to name. The ability to look at where human behavior is heading, at what people want and how they will behave when given the right tool to pursue it, and trace that all the way to an outcome that nobody else can see yet. South Park saw it in 1999, in a silly episode about a fake Pokemon game. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while that prediction required looking 17 years into the future of technology, the next one required something different. It required looking at the entire American legal and political system around technology and data, and correctly describing the moment when ordinary people would realize they had been agreeing to things they never actually read, giving away rights they did not know they had, to companies they trusted without question. South Park described that moment too, years before most people had any idea it was coming. Section 8. Nobody reads the terms. Human Centipede, Season 15, Episode 1, 2011. There is a box that appears on almost every screen you have ever used. It shows up when you download an app. It shows up when you create an account. It shows up when you update your software or sign up for a new service or connect a device to something new. The box contains a long block of text. The text is written in small print and uses words that most people never learned in school. It goes on for pages. Sometimes it goes on for dozens of pages. At the bottom of the box, there are two buttons. One says decline, one says agree. Almost everyone clicks agree. Almost nobody reads what they are agreeing to. South Park built an entire episode around this in 2011. And what they predicted was not just that people would keep clicking agree without reading. They predicted the world that would grow up around that habit. The world where companies had learned that they could put almost anything inside those long blocks of small print text, and the vast majority of people would hand over their rights, their data, their privacy, and in the episode's most extreme and horrifying version of the joke, their actual bodies, without ever knowing they had done it. The episode was called quote_30_. It aired on April 27th, 2011, and it is, depending on your tolerance for extremely uncomfortable comedy, either one of the most brilliant things South Park has ever done, or one of the most difficult to sit through, possibly both at the same time. Here is what happens. Kyle gets a new iPhone. When he sets it up, he is presented with the iTunes Terms and Conditions, the long legal document that Apple requires users to agree to before they can use the device. Kyle does what almost everyone does. He scrolls to the bottom without reading anything and clicks agree. What Kyle has actually agreed to, buried deep inside the Terms and Conditions document that he did not read, is to participate in a human experiment. Apple, in the world of this episode, has included a clause in their terms and conditions allowing them to use a small number of users as physical components in a new device. The device is a combination of a human being and an iPad, directly inspired by the horror movie The Human Centipede, which had become a widely discussed and deeply disturbing internet phenomenon in 2009 and 2010. Apple operatives show up at Kyle's house, confirm that he did indeed click agree, and take him away to be part of the experiment. His parents are outraged. They try to fight it, but the legal reality inside the world of the episode is that Kyle agreed. He clicked the button. He is bound by what he agreed to, even though he had no idea what he was agreeing to, because the law in the episode treats the act of clicking agree as a fully informed and voluntary decision, regardless of whether the person who clicked it ever actually read the document. Now, the human experiment part is where the episode goes into pure South Park absurdism. It is deliberately extreme and deliberately disgusting because that is the show's way of making sure you cannot ignore the point it is making. The discomfort is the vehicle. Parker and Stone understood that if they made a quiet, reasonable episode about terms and conditions being too long and too complicated, nobody would watch it twice. By making it the most extreme possible version of the joke, they ensured that anyone who saw the episode would never click agree on a long legal document in quite the same casual way again. But strip away the extreme horror movie element, and what the episode is describing is something completely real and completely serious. Companies were, in 2011, already burying significant things inside terms and conditions documents that the vast majority of users never read. Not human experiments, but real things. Things like the right to collect and sell your personal data, the right to track your location, the right to access your contacts, your photos, your messages, the right to change the terms of their service at any time without direct notification, the right to use your content in ways you might not expect or want, the right to take legal disputes to arbitration instead of court, which typically favors the company over the individual. All of this was sitting in documents that people were clicking through every single day in 2011 and had been clicking through for years before that without reading a word. South Park looked at this habit and followed it to its logical extreme. If you will agree to something without reading it, the episode was asking, then how do you know what you have agreed to? And if you do not know what you have agreed to, then what does the word agree even mean? Is it a genuine choice if you never actually evaluated the options? These questions, which the episode asked in the most extreme and uncomfortable way possible, became the central questions of a decade of legal, political, and cultural debate about technology companies and their relationship with their users. In 2014, a UK internet provider ran a test that became famous for exactly the reasons South Park had identified 3 years earlier. The company buried a clause in their terms and conditions for a free public Wi-Fi service. The clause stated that users were agreeing to give up their firstborn child as payment for the service. The clause was there to make a point. Thousands of people agreed to the terms without ever noticing the clause. The company revealed it publicly to demonstrate that people were clicking agree on documents they had never read, giving away things they had no intention of giving away, simply because they trusted that the document was standard and harmless. South Park had made this exact point in 2011, with a cartoon about an iPad and a horror movie reference. By the mid-2010s, the conversation about terms and conditions had grown into one of the most significant debates in technology and law. When Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified before the United States Congress in 2018, one of the most repeated themes in the questioning was the idea that users had technically agreed to Facebook's data practices, but had done so without genuinely understanding what they were agreeing to. Senator after senator asked versions of the same question. If your terms and conditions are so long and so complicated that ordinary people cannot understand them, is consent even real? That is the question the Human Centipede episode was asking in 2011. In a cartoon about Apple and an iPad. In 2023, the European Union introduced new rules specifically designed to address this problem. The rules required companies to present their terms and conditions in plain, simple language that ordinary people could actually understand. They required that consent be genuine and informed, not just a click on a box at the bottom of a document nobody read. The legal concept of meaningful consent versus the technical fiction of consent that comes from clicking agree without reading became a central part of international technology law. South Park described why this was necessary in a 22-minute cartoon 12 years earlier. There is a specific scene in the episode that deserves particular attention. Kyle's parents try to get him released from the Apple experiment. They bring the situation to a lawyer. The lawyer reviews the iTunes terms and conditions document and confirms that yes, Kyle did agree to it, and yes, the agreement is legally binding. When Kyle's mother expresses outrage that anyone could agree to something without understanding it and have that treated as a real agreement, the lawyer explains the simple legal reality. It does not matter whether Kyle understood what he was agreeing to. It matters that he clicked the button. The agreement is the click, not the understanding. That specific legal point that a click counts as binding binding agreement regardless of comprehension was being actively debated in real courts and real legislatures throughout the 2000s and 10s. The argument that terms and conditions documents were so long, so complicated, and so deliberately difficult to understand that they could not produce genuine informed consent was made by consumer advocates, legal scholars, and eventually lawmakers across multiple countries. The argument on the other side, that users had been given the option to read the document and had chosen not to, and that their click therefore constituted valid agreement, was made by technology companies in court cases and regulatory hearings around the world. South Park dramatized this exact legal argument in 2011, with Kyle trying to get out of a human experiment because he clicked agree without reading. There is also something in the episode about how Apple specifically is depicted that became more interesting as the years went on. In the episode, Apple under Steve Jobs is shown as a company that is completely comfortable with the idea that their users will not read their terms. They have designed the system specifically to take advantage of this. The document is long, the language is complicated, the important parts are buried. This is not an accident, it is a strategy. In the years after the episode aired, internal documents and legal cases involving multiple major technology companies revealed that this portrait was not entirely inaccurate. Companies had studied user behavior around terms and conditions documents. They knew almost nobody read them. They had made decisions about what to include in those documents based on the knowledge that the vast majority of their users would never know it was there. The length and complexity of the documents was not always a byproduct of legal necessity. Sometimes it was a feature. South Park called this in 2011. The episode was also notable for another reason that has nothing to do with predictions. It was the episode at the center of a documentary called 6 Days to Air, which showed the behind-the-scenes process of how South Park is made. The documentary followed Parker and Stone through the entire process of writing, animating, recording, and finishing Human Centipede in less than a week. It is one of the most revealing documents about how the show actually works. And it shows that the episode's central idea, a man being caught inside terms and conditions he agreed to without reading, came together in the middle of the production week almost by accident. That is one of the stranger things about this prediction. It was not the result of careful long-term planning or deep research. It came from Parker and Stone looking at something everyone was doing every day, clicking through legal documents without reading them, and asking the simplest possible question about it. What if someone actually held you to what you agreed to? What if the thing you agreed to was terrible? What if the law sided with the company and not with you? Those questions, generated in about 6 days in a cartoon production office, turned out to map almost perfectly onto the most significant technology and consumer rights debates of the following decade. Everyone was clicking agree. Nobody was reading the terms. South Park saw where that was going before the rest of the world did. Quote 31 __. And as sharp as this prediction was about the relationship between people and the technology companies they trust without thinking, the next one cuts even closer to home. Because while South Park was describing what happens when people stop paying attention to what they are agreeing to online, they were also, 6 years earlier, describing what happens when an entire society stops paying attention to what is happening to real people in front of their eyes. And they did it through the story of a young woman whose destruction was being broadcast live to the entire world. Section 9. The media was killing Britney. Quote 32 __. Season 12, Episode 2, 2008. There are moments in this show's history where South Park stops being a comedy and becomes something closer to a document. Not a comedy with a serious point buried inside the jokes. Not a cartoon that makes you laugh first and think second. Something more direct than that. Something that looks at what is happening in the world and says clearly and without apology that what everyone is watching and participating in is not entertainment. It is something much darker. And the fact that it is being broadcast as entertainment, that millions of people are consuming it as a form of fun, is not a detail. It is the whole problem. Britney's New Look is that kind of episode. It aired on March 19th, 2008, and when it aired, most critics said it was not funny enough. They said it was too serious, too heavy, too focused on making a point at the expense of the comedy. They gave it mixed reviews and moved on. They missed what the episode was actually doing. What it was actually doing was describing with remarkable accuracy a cultural pattern that would not be fully understood or talked about openly for another decade. A pattern about how the media selects certain young women, builds them up into enormous public figures, and then systematically tears them apart for the entertainment of an audience that participates in the destruction without ever recognizing their own role in it. A pattern about how this process is not accidental or random, how it follows a specific shape, hits hits specific beats, and ends in a specific place. A pattern that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. And in the final minute of the episode, South Park named the next victim before she became one. To understand the episode fully, you need to understand what was happening with Britney Spears in 2007 and early 2008, because that is the real-world situation the episode is responding to. Britney Spears had been one of the biggest pop stars in the world since the late 1990s. She had sold millions of records, she had been on the cover of every magazine, she had been one of the most watched and most photographed people on the planet for nearly a decade. And then, starting around 2006 and accelerating through 2007, her life began to fall apart publicly in ways that were broadcast live to the world. Her marriage ended, a custody battle over her children became national news. She was photographed in moments of obvious distress. In February 2007, she walked into a hair salon and shaved her own head. The footage and the photos of that moment went everywhere. It was treated as a spectacle, as entertainment, as something to laugh at and comment on and discuss on talk shows and gossip websites. The woman at the center of it was clearly struggling in ways that went far beyond celebrity scandal, and the response of the media and the public was to consume her suffering as content. South Park responded to this in March 2008 with an episode that, even by the show's standards, was willing to go to a very dark place. In the episode, Stan and Kyle trick Britney Spears into letting them take photos of her, which they then sell. Britney, in the episode, is a real person who is visibly breaking down. She is not a villain. She is not someone who deserves what is happening to her. She is someone who is being hunted by cameras and by crowds and by a media machine that has decided her pain is worth money. She attempts to take her own life in the episode. She survives, but she is severely injured. And rather than the world responding with compassion or concern, the media and the public simply adjust. They find a new angle. They find a new way to continue consuming her story. The injury becomes part of the spectacle. The episode's central argument is laid out through a reveal near the end. It turns out that the entire process, the building up and the tearing down of Britney Spears, is something the town of South Park has been participating in as part of a ritual. The ritual is described as something the culture requires, a sacrifice, a young woman elevated to enormous fame and then systematically destroyed so that the community can feel something. The show draws a direct comparison to older historical rituals, where communities would choose a figure to carry the weight of everything they needed to expel, and then destroy that figure to feel cleansed. The episode is brutal and uncomfortable and not particularly funny in the way that most South Park episodes are funny. It is making a serious argument about the relationship between celebrity culture, media, and the audience that consumes both. It is saying that the people watching are not innocent bystanders. They are participants. The attention is the fuel. The clicks and the views and the magazine sales and the gossip discussions are all part of the same machine that is grinding this person down. Critics in 2008 did not fully receive this argument. The reviews were mixed. Some critics felt the episode was trying too hard to make a point. Some felt it was mean-spirited. Some felt it simply was not funny enough to justify its darkness. The show moved on. Then something happened at the very end of the episode that most people noticed, but few took seriously at the time. After Britney's destruction is complete, a news anchor in the episode looks into the camera and announces that the ritual has been fulfilled for another year. And then, almost as a throwaway line, almost as a small dark joke tacked onto the end of a dark episode, the anchor says that the process will begin again next year, and the name they give for the next target is Miley Cyrus. In March 2008, Miley Cyrus was 16 years old. She was the star of a Disney Channel show called Hannah Montana. She was one of the most popular figures in children's entertainment. She was considered wholesome, family-friendly, safe. The idea that she was about to go through the same kind of media destruction that the episode had just depicted felt, to most people watching it, like a random joke, a name pulled out of the air for shock value. It was not random, and it was not a joke. In the months following the episode's airing, things began to shift around Miley Cyrus. Photos from a Vanity Fair magazine shoot that year, taken when she was 15, created a controversy about how young female celebrities were being photographed and presented to the public. The coverage was intense and largely focused on her rather than on the adults who had made decisions about how she was photographed. The scrutiny that followed her grew throughout 2008 and into the following years. By 2013, Miley Cyrus had undergone a very dramatic and very public transformation in her image and her music. The wholesome Disney star image was gone. Her public appearances and music videos were deliberately provocative. Her performance at the MTV Video Music Awards in August 2013 became one of the most discussed and most criticized moments in recent pop culture history. The media coverage was enormous. The public reaction was intense. People who had grown up watching Hannah Montana were now consuming Miley Cyrus content in a completely different register. her, and the machine that generated opinions and coverage and commentary about her was running at full speed. South Park had named her as the next target in March 2008, 5 years before the most intense period of media focus on her arrived. But the deeper prediction in the episode is not about Britney or Miley specifically. It is about the pattern, the specific, repeatable, predictable pattern of how the media and the public treat young women who become extremely famous at a young age. The pattern goes like this. A young woman is elevated to enormous fame, usually before she is old enough to have any real power over the decisions being made about her. She is packaged and presented and sold to an audience. The audience consumes her. Then, at some point, something shifts. She makes a choice that does not fit the image she was packaged in, or something in her private life becomes public, or she simply grows up in a way that the audience did not want or expect. And when that happens, the same media machine that built her up begins to tear her down. The coverage becomes negative. The commentary becomes cruel. The audiences that once adored her feel a specific kind of excitement about watching her struggle, because there is something in human psychology that finds the fall of a celebrated person more compelling than the rise. The machine knows this. It produces content that feeds this response, and the audience, clicking and watching and sharing, powers the machine without asking whether what they are participating in is something they would choose to do if they thought about it clearly. The episode described this pattern in 2008. The decade that followed gave that pattern a name. The Free Britney movement, which emerged in a serious way around 2019 and built through 2020 and 2021, was a public reckoning with exactly what the episode had described. People who had consumed Britney Spears' suffering as entertainment in 2007 and 2008 began to look back at that period and recognize what had actually been happening. Documentaries were made, articles were written, conversations happened that should have happened 15 years earlier. The conclusion that a large number of people arrived at, after looking at the evidence and the timeline and the coverage, was that the media treatment of Britney Spears during her most difficult period had been predatory. It had been harmful, and the audience that had consumed it had been a participant in something it had never consciously agreed to participate in. South Park had said this in March 2008, in an episode that critics said was not funny enough. What Parker and Stone understood that most people did not in 2008 was that the relationship between the media and the audience is not passive. Audiences do not simply watch, they participate. Their attention is the product. Their engagement is the fuel. The clicks and the views and the magazine purchases and the gossip conversations are all active choices that power the machine that produces the content. When the content being produced is the destruction of a real person, the audience is not an innocent bystander. It is a co-author. That argument, made in a cartoon in 2008, became one of the most important media criticism arguments of the following 15 years. And the specific detail at the end of the episode, the naming of Miley Cyrus as the next target, shows that Parker and Stone were not just describing a general pattern. They were able to look at the specific landscape of young female celebrities in 2008 and identify who was most likely to be next in line. They could see the machine selecting its next figure. They could see who was positioned in the right place to become the next focal point of the cycle. They were right. They said it in a throwaway line at the end of an episode that critics dismissed for not being funny enough. That combination, the pattern prediction and the specific name, makes this one of the most complete and most uncomfortable predictions in the show's history. Not because of what it says about Britney or Miley, but because of what it says about the rest of us, about the audience, about the people watching, about the machine that runs on attention and produces content out of real people's real pain. South Park held up a mirror in 2008 and showed that audience what they looked like. Most people glanced at it and looked away. The full meaning of what was in that mirror took another decade to sink in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while this episode was looking at the way media destroys real people in public view, South Park was also, years earlier, looking at a very different kind of destruction. The quiet, slow, generational destruction of a symbol, a flag, a piece of cloth with a specific history, and how that symbol would one day sit at the center of one of the most heated and widespread cultural arguments the country had ever seen. Section 10. The Confederate flag debate was coming. Chef Goes Nanners. Season 4, Episode 7, 2000. There are arguments that seem like they belong to a specific moment in time. Arguments that feel so tied to a particular news cycle, a particular event, a particular week of headlines, that it is easy to assume they came out of nowhere, that they were born in that specific moment, triggered by that specific event, and that before that moment, nobody was really thinking about them in any serious way. The debate about Confederate symbols in public spaces felt like that kind of argument to a lot of people when it exploded across the United States in 2015 and then again in 2020. It felt sudden. It felt like something new had arrived. It felt like a conversation that had not existed before and was now everywhere all at once, dividing communities and families and political parties along lines that seemed to appear overnight. South Park had been having that conversation since July 5th, 2000. The episode was called Chef Goes Nanners, and while it is remembered by most fans for a subplot involving Jimbo and a romance that develops through an unlikely set of circumstances, the main story of the episode is a precise, careful, and surprisingly mature examination of exactly the debate that would consume the country 15 to 20 years later. Here is what happens. The town of South Park has a town flag. The flag has been the official symbol of the town for a very long time. It is part of the town's identity and history. People are proud of it the way people are proud of symbols that connect them to where they come from. The flag depicts 4 white stick figures standing around a black stick figure who is hanging from a noose. Chef looks at this flag and sees something that is completely clear to him. He sees a symbol of racial violence. He sees an image that depicts a black person being killed by white people, presented as the official symbol of the community he lives in. He sees something that says, whether the people displaying it intend this message or not, that this is the history this town is choosing to represent itself with. He brings this to the attention of the town and asks for the flag to be changed. The town divides immediately. On one side is Chef, arguing that the flag is racist and must be changed. His argument is simple. The image on the flag depicts a black person being hanged by white people. That is what it shows. That is what it has always shown. Regardless of tradition, regardless of how long it has been the town symbol, regardless of what anyone says it means to them personally, what the image actually depicts is racial violence. And a community should not use an image of racial violence as its official symbol. On the other side is Jimbo and a large portion of the town, arguing that the flag is part of their heritage. Their argument is also, from their perspective, simple. The flag has been the town's symbol for as long as anyone can remember. It is part of their history. Changing it would mean erasing that history, pretending it did not happen, giving in to pressure from people who want to rewrite the past. The flag is not about racism to them. It is about tradition, about pride in where they come from, about not allowing a small group of people to take away something that belongs to everyone. Both arguments are presented in the episode without either side being made to look obviously stupid or obviously correct. That is an important detail. South Park did not make this a simple story where one side was right and the other side was wrong. They made it a genuine argument between people who held their positions with real conviction and were not going to be easily moved. The boys are put in the middle. They are assigned to debate the issue in school, with some of them arguing for keeping the flag and others arguing for changing it. What happens during their preparation is one of the episode's most interesting observations. The children approach the flag as a visual image without the weight of history that the adults carry. They look at it and most of them, across racial lines, simply see it as an offensive image that should not be the town's symbol, because the image itself is offensive regardless of the tradition attached to it. It is only the adults who are fully locked into the argument about heritage and history, because it is only the adults who have spent their whole lives being told what the flag means, rather than looking at what the flag shows. That observation, that children often see these things more clearly because they have not yet been taught the stories that adults use to justify what they are seeing, became a real part of the national conversation about Confederate symbols in the years that followed. The episode aired on July 5th, 2000. 15 years later, everything changed. In June 2015, a gunman entered a historically black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 people during a Bible study session. The gunman had been photographed with Confederate flags before the attack, and in the immediate aftermath, a national conversation erupted about the role of Confederate symbols in public life. The conversation was not entirely new. It had been happening in various forms for decades, but the events in Charleston gave it a specific and devastating urgency that it had not had before. Within weeks, major retailers across the United States announced they would stop selling Confederate flag merchandise. Walmart, Amazon, Sears, and other large companies made the decision quickly and publicly. South Carolina, which had flown a Confederate battle flag on the grounds of its state capitol building since the 1960s, voted to remove it. Other states began reviewing their own use of Confederate symbols on official buildings, license plates, and government property. The argument that followed was almost word for word the argument in the South Park episode from 2000. On one side, people argued that Confederate symbols represented a history of racial violence and oppression, that they had been used as symbols of resistance to civil rights progress, and that having them displayed on public buildings and sold in mainstream stores sent a message about whose history was being honored and whose was being dismissed. On the other side, people argued that removing these symbols was an erasure of history, an attack on Southern heritage and culture, an attempt by one group of people to impose their interpretation of history on everyone else. Heritage versus hatred, tradition versus harm, history versus who that history actually belonged to. South Park laid out both sides of this argument in 2000 in a cartoon about a fictional town flag, 15 years before the country was consumed by the same debate about real symbols in real places. And then in 2020, the conversation came back even more powerfully. Following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020, a wave of protest and reckoning about racial justice swept across the United States and much of the world. As part of that reckoning, Confederate statues and monuments became focal points in a way they had not been before. Statues were removed by local governments. Some were taken down by protesters directly. The debate about Confederate symbols expanded from flags on government buildings to monuments in public parks, military base names, school names, and street names. The same core argument from the South Park episode in 2000 was now playing out across every level of American society, in every medium, in every corner of the country. What makes the episode's prediction particularly precise is not just that it identified the right argument, it is that it identified the specific reason why the argument is so difficult to resolve. The episode does not end with one side winning cleanly. The compromise the town reaches in the episode is not really a compromise at all. It is an attempt to satisfy both sides that ends up fully satisfying neither. The image on the flag is changed slightly, but the fundamental tension between what the flag represents to different people in the community is not resolved. It is just papered over for the moment. That is exactly what happened in real life with many Confederate symbol debates. Flags were removed from some places but not others. Statues came down in some cities but stayed up in others. Each decision was contested. Each compromise was challenged. The underlying disagreement about what these symbols meant, who they honored, and what keeping or removing them said about a community's values was never fully resolved. It was addressed in specific cases and then it came back somewhere else. South Park predicted that too. Not just the argument, the shape of how the argument would go, the fact that it would not resolve cleanly, the fact that both sides would remain convinced they were right, the fact that the compromises would feel inadequate to everyone involved. There is a specific moment in the episode where Chef explains his position to the children, and what he says is not complicated or theoretical. He looks at the flag and describes simply what he sees. He sees an image of a black person being killed by white people. He does not see heritage. He does not see tradition. He sees what is in the image, and he asks how it can be acceptable for that image to be the official symbol of the community he lives in. That argument, stated that plainly, became the central argument of the real debates that followed. The people calling for the removal of Confederate symbols were making essentially the same point Chef makes in 2000. Look at what this symbol actually is. Look at what it actually depicts. Look at the history it is actually connected to, and then ask yourself whether that is what you want representing your community. The people on the other side were making Jimbo's argument. This is part of our history. Removing it does not change what happened. It only removes the acknowledgement that it happened. Changing a symbol does not heal the wound underneath it. Both arguments are real. Both arguments were made in this cartoon in 2000. Both arguments were made in American city halls and state legislatures and on national television throughout 2015 and 2020. South Park was having that debate when it was still, for most people, a local issue. A question about flags in southern states that most of the country had not fully engaged with yet. A conversation that felt from a distance like something specific and regional rather than something that would eventually involve every major retailer in the country and prompt the removal of statues and the renaming of military bases. Parker and Stone saw it clearly in 2000. They saw that the argument was not going to stay local. They saw that the question of what symbols a community chooses to represent itself with with and whose pain those symbols carry was going to get louder and more widespread. They put the whole thing in a cartoon about a small mountain town and a stick figure drawing on a flag. 20 years later, the country caught up to the conversation South Park had already finished. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while this episode was looking at the slow building tension around a symbol that had been visible for decades, the next prediction was about something almost the opposite. Not something old and visible, but something brand new and hidden. Something that most people in 2014 had just discovered existed and had absolutely no idea was quietly designed to reach into their psychology and pull money out of them without them fully realizing what was happening. South Park saw that coming too, and they explained it better than most economists ever managed to. Section 11. Mobile gaming was designed to ruin you. Freemium isn't free. Season 18, Episode 6, 2014. There is a type of trap that does not look like a trap. It does not have teeth or chains or walls. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for anything up front. In fact, the first thing it tells you is that it is completely free. You do not have to pay anything. You do not have to commit to anything. You just have to try it. Just download it, just open it, just play for a little while and see if you like it. It will not cost you a thing. And then, slowly, almost without you noticing, it starts to cost you everything. This is the freemium mobile game, and South Park explained exactly how it worked, exactly why it worked, and exactly who it was designed to hurt in a single episode that aired on November 5th, 2014. The episode was called Freemium Isn't Free. It was written and directed entirely by Trey Parker. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award, and it predicted with a level of accuracy that researchers and governments would spend the following decade trying to catch up to, the full scale of a mobile gaming industry built on exploiting human weakness for profit. To understand why this prediction matters so much, you need to understand what the mobile gaming world looked like in 2014 and what it became in the years that followed. In 2014, the freemium model, meaning a game that is free to download but charges real money for things inside the game, had been growing for several years. Games like The Simpsons Tapped Out and Family Guy The Quest for Stuff were hugely popular. They were free to download, they were built around familiar characters from shows people already loved, and inside them, they asked players to spend small amounts of real money on virtual currency that could be used to buy things in the game. $1 here, $3 there, $5 for a special item, $10 for a bundle. None of those individual purchases felt significant. That was the design. Parker and Stone had been approached by multiple companies about making a South Park freemium mobile game. They turned down every pitch. And instead of just quietly saying no and moving on, they did what they always do with things they find troubling. They made an episode about it. But first they did something they did not usually do for a single episode. They did an enormous amount of research. Parker and Stone have spoken about this directly. They said they went deep into studying how freemium games actually worked, how they were built, what psychological mechanisms they used, and who ended up paying the most money. What they found disturbed them enough that they built an entire episode around it. The episode centers on a new mobile game based on the fictional South Park characters Terrence and Phillip. Jimmy tells the other boys about it at school. He describes it as totally free. The boys download it. They find it boring. They spend a few dollars on it and stop. But Stan becomes obsessed. He keeps playing. He keeps spending. $1 becomes $10. $10 becomes $100. Within days, Stan has charged nearly $500 to his parents' credit card without fully realizing how it happened. His father, Randy, finds out and is furious. But Randy is also, as the episode carefully points out, someone with his own addictive tendencies around alcohol. The episode draws a direct and deliberate line between Stan's relationship with the game and Randy's relationship with drinking. Both are presented not as moral failures, but as the predictable outcomes of people with certain psychological tendencies being exposed to something specifically engineered to exploit those tendencies. This is the most important thing the episode gets right, and it gets it right in 2014, before most of the world had fully understood it yet. The freemium gaming industry was not accidentally addictive, it was deliberately addictive. The games were engineered, using research into human psychology and behavior to identify and exploit the specific mental patterns that make certain people unable to stop. The reward systems inside the games were built to trigger the release of dopamine, the chemical in the brain associated with pleasure and reward, in patterns that encouraged repeated engagement and repeated spending. South Park explained this inside the episode through a scene involving Satan, not as a joke, as a genuine explanation of how addiction works. Satan appears and explains to Stan that addiction is not a character flaw, it is a biological process. When you do something pleasurable, your brain releases dopamine. Over time, if you keep triggering that release artificially, you need more and more of the trigger to get the same feeling. The game is designed to be that trigger. The spending is the mechanism. The person caught in the loop is not stupid or weak. They are human, and they are being targeted precisely because they are human. This explanation, delivered by a cartoon Satan in a South Park episode in 2014, is functionally accurate to how addiction research describes the mechanism, and it was being delivered to a mainstream audience years before the conversation about mobile game addiction became a serious public health discussion. The episode also contains a scene that is one of the most accurate and most damning descriptions of the freemium business model ever put on screen. The Minister of Mobile Gaming, who operates as the episode's antagonist, explains the model directly. He describes how the games are built to be deliberately unengaging unless the player spends money. He explains that a small percentage of players, the ones with the strongest addictive tendencies, will end up spending enormous amounts. He refers to these players not with sympathy, but as the foundation of the entire business. The industry does not need everyone to spend a lot. It needs a small group of vulnerable people to spend everything. He compares this directly to the alcohol industry. He points out that alcohol companies know that a small percentage of their customers will become dependent on their product and will spend far more than an occasional drinker. He says the alcohol industry does not consider this a problem. They consider it a business model, and the freemium gaming industry was operating on the same logic, with the same lack of concern for the people being harmed. The comparison to the alcohol industry is not just a joke. It is a precise description of how industries that profit from addictive behavior have historically operated. And it placed the freemium mobile gaming industry inside that history years before regulators and researchers were using that same framing in official reports and legal proceedings. In 2018 and 2019, the governments of Belgium and the Netherlands both ruled that certain mobile game mechanics, specifically the loot box systems where players pay real money for a random chance at a virtual item, constituted gambling and were therefore illegal under their existing gambling laws. The argument they used was essentially the one South Park had made in 2014. These mechanics were designed to exploit the psychology of addiction. They targeted vulnerable people. They extracted money through systems that operated like gambling without being regulated as gambling. And the companies building them knew exactly what they were doing. By 2023, class action lawsuits against mobile gaming companies in the United States were becoming common. Players who had spent enormous amounts of money on games and game systems they had not fully understood were arguing in court that the mechanics were predatory, that they were designed to deceive, that the free label was a deliberate misrepresentation of how the system actually worked. South Park called all of this in 2014 with the title of the episode. The meum is Latin for not really. Freemium is not free. The free label is the trap door, the thing that gets you inside before you understand what you have walked into. Parker and Stone said in interviews that making this episode required them to genuinely understand the mechanics they were satirizing. They researched the Pareto principle, an idea in economics that describes how a small percentage of participants in any system account for a large percentage of the total activity. 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of the players. In the context of freemium gaming, this meant that the industry was built on finding the 20%, or in many cases a much smaller percentage than that, who would spend at levels that subsidized everyone else's free experience. What that actually means in human terms is that for every person playing a freemium game for free and having fun, somewhere in the background there is a smaller group of people with addictive tendencies who are spending far more than they can afford. The free experience for the majority is being paid for by the suffering of the minority, and the minority being exploited is the one least equipped to protect itself. The episode makes this point not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. The Minister of Mobile Gaming is not presented as a cartoon villain who enjoys causing harm. He is presented as someone who has looked at the numbers, understood the mechanism, decided the profit was worth the cost, and moved on. He is not unusual. He is just honest about what the industry is doing. That portrait of quiet, business-like exploitation became one of the most recognized features of the real mobile gaming industry as the decade after 2014 unfolded. The companies building these games were not staffed by people who saw themselves as villains. They were staffed by designers and data scientists and business analysts who were following the numbers and optimizing for engagement and revenue. The harm being caused to vulnerable players was not the goal. It was the acceptable cost. South Park drew that picture in 2014. The investigations, lawsuits, and regulatory hearings of the following decade confirmed it. The episode was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. Parker and Stone called it their favorite episode of that season, And while it won recognition for its craft and its comedy, what it deserves equal recognition for is the fact that it explained a multi-billion-dollar industry's exploitation of human psychology with complete accuracy years before governments and regulators and journalists had fully mapped it out. Freemium is not free. The meum is Latin for not really. South Park said it first. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while this episode was exposing the hidden machinery of an industry that was quietly extracting money from millions of people who did not fully understand what was happening, the final section of this essay is about something even larger. About the moment South Park looked at the entire internet, the thing the modern world runs on, and asked the most basic and most frightening question possible. What happens when it goes away? And what does the answer to that question tell us about who we have already become? Section 12. We were always this addicted. Overlogging. Season 12, Episode 6, 2008. There is a question that almost nobody was asking in 2008. Not politicians, not researchers, not doctors, not teachers, not parents, not the people building the technology, not the people using it. Nobody, or almost nobody, was sitting down and asking the question that needed to be asked about what was quietly happening to the relationship between human beings and the internet. The question was simple. What happens to us when it goes away? Not what happens to our economy, although that is part of it. Not what happens to our communication systems or our businesses or our infrastructure, although all of that matters too. What happens to us? To people? To the way we feel and think and function and relate to each other when the thing we have been quietly building our entire inner lives around suddenly disappears? South Park asked that question on April 16, 2008, in an episode called Overlogging, and the answer they gave was so accurate, so specific, and so far ahead of where the public conversation actually was at the time that watching it now feels less like watching a cartoon and more like reading something that was written after the fact. Like someone went forward in time, watched what happened to society over the next 15 years, came back and turned it into a 22-minute episode. To understand what makes this prediction so remarkable, you need to understand what the internet was in 2008. In 2008, smartphones existed but were still new. The iPhone had only been released the year before. Social media was growing but had not yet become the central organizing structure of daily life that it would become. Facebook was 4 years old. Twitter was 2 years old. Instagram did not exist yet. TikTok would not exist for another 9 years. The idea of someone spending hours every day on their phone scrolling through content was not yet a normal description of how most adults spent their free time. The internet in 2008 was used heavily, but it was still largely seen as a tool, something you went to when you needed it, something you used for specific purposes and then stepped away from. The idea that it had already become something more than a tool, something closer to a psychological need, something that people had become genuinely dependent on in ways they did not fully understand, was not a mainstream conversation yet. South Park started that conversation in 2008. The episode opens with a completely normal evening in the Marsh household. Stan is browsing the internet without any particular purpose. His sister Shelly is video chatting with a boy she likes who lives in another state. Randy is watching internet content in a way that makes clear he would prefer nobody knew exactly what he was watching. Sharon tells everyone to go to bed. The internet will still be there tomorrow. The next morning, the internet is gone. Not just in the Marsh house, everywhere. The entire internet has stopped working across South Park, and it quickly becomes clear across most of the United States. Nobody can connect, nobody can get online, and within hours of this happening, the town begins to fall apart. What follows is one of the most precise portraits of internet dependency that has ever appeared in any medium. And the precision is not in the big dramatic moments. It is in the small, specific human details of how each character responds to the absence of the thing they did not fully realize they needed until it was gone. Stan does not know what to do with himself. He wanders around the house. He tries to find other things to occupy his time. He cannot settle into any of them. The absence of the internet is not just an inconvenience. It is a kind of emptiness, a restlessness, the feeling of reaching for something that is not there, over and over, without being able to stop the reaching even when you know the thing is gone. Shelley becomes frantic about her online boyfriend. She has an entire relationship with this person that exists only through the internet. Without the connection, the relationship does not exist. She is not just bored, she is grieving something real, even though the relationship it is built around was never fully physical or present in the traditional sense. The episode treats this grief seriously. It does not mock her for having an online relationship. It observes that the emotional investment she has placed in it is real, even if the medium it existed through was virtual. Randy's response is the most extreme and the most uncomfortable. Randy has been using the internet specifically to access a kind of content that requires complete privacy. Without the internet, he cannot access this content. What the episode shows is not just that Randy is frustrated by this, it shows withdrawal. Genuine physical, psychological withdrawal. The kind that makes a person behave irrationally. The kind that makes them desperate in ways that would be recognizable to anyone who has studied what happens to people when something they are genuinely dependent on is suddenly taken away. The episode does not treat this as a moral failing on Randy's part. It treats it as a consequence, a predictable outcome of a person developing a strong dependency on a particular kind of stimulation that the internet provided, without ever being asked to think about what that dependency was building into. Randy hears that there may still be some internet available in California. He immediately decides the family is moving west to find it. And here the episode shifts into something broader and more extraordinary. Parker and Stone structured the episode as a direct reference to The Grapes of Wrath, a famous American novel by John Steinbeck about families during the 1930s who lost everything in the Dust Bowl and migrated to California in desperate search of a better life. In the novel, the migration is one of the defining images of American suffering during that period. Entire families leaving everything behind, traveling hundreds of miles, driven by the most basic human need to survive. In the episode, the Marsh family does the same thing. They pack up their belongings. They drive west. They are not alone. There are thousands of others doing the same thing. A massive migration of people moving toward the rumor of internet access, driven by a need that they cannot explain rationally but cannot deny either. By treating the loss of internet access with the same dramatic weight as a genuine humanitarian crisis, South Park was making an argument that almost nobody in 2008 was willing to make openly, that the internet was no longer just a convenience, that it had already become something people were genuinely dependent on, that removing it would not just cause inconvenience, it would cause a crisis, a real human, psychological, and social crisis that would affect people the way any sudden removal of a deep dependency affects them. In 2008, that argument sounded like an exaggeration. It sounded like satire pushed too far for comic effect. Nobody was going to have a breakdown because they could not get online. Nobody was going to migrate across the country for a Wi-Fi signal. Then the world changed. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in early 2020 and, among many other things, made clear exactly how dependent modern society had become on internet access. When lockdowns began and people were confined to their homes, the internet was not a convenience. It was the only way people could work, the only way children could attend school, the only way people could see their doctors, the only way people could maintain relationships with anyone outside their immediate household, the only way many people could access food, medication, or any of the basic necessities of life. When internet access failed during this period, even briefly, the response was not mild annoyance, it was genuine panic. People who lost connection felt cut off in ways that went far beyond inconvenience. Their work stopped. Their children's education stopped. Their social contact stopped. Their sense of connection to the world stopped. The dependency that South Park had described in 2008 as a joke about a man driving to California for Wi-Fi had become one of the defining realities of modern human life. The Marsh family's migration in the episode mirrors exactly the desperation that millions of real people felt when their internet access was unreliable or unavailable during periods when the world had moved entirely online. The emotional weight of the episode, which critics in 2008 found excessive and dramatically overblown for what was supposed to be a comedy, turned out to be the right weight, the appropriate level of seriousness for what was actually at stake. There is a specific detail near the end of the episode that deserves attention because it is one of the most quietly brilliant things South Park has ever done. Kyle eventually figures out that the internet is not some vast, mysterious, impossible to understand system. He traces the problem back to its source and finds that the entire internet in the world of the episode runs through a single massive router. The router has simply stopped working. Kyle unplugs it and plugs it back in. The internet comes back. Everything returns to normal. The joke is about the universal experience of being told to turn something off and turn it back on again to fix it. It is a simple gag, but it is also saying something about the relationship relationship between the enormous power the internet has over people's lives and the fragility of the infrastructure that power depends on. The thing that the entire world was falling apart without was, at its most basic level, a piece of hardware in a room somewhere, something you could unplug with your hands. The gap between how important the internet had become to people and how fragile the physical systems it ran on actually were became a real conversation in the years after 2008. Major internet outages affecting millions of users caused economic disruption, social disruption, and responses from the public that confirmed exactly what South Park had described. People did not respond calmly to losing internet access. They responded with urgency and anxiety and a kind of desperation that matched the dependency the episode had described. There is also a detail about Shelley's online relationship that has only become more resonant over time. In the episode, Shelley is in a genuine emotional relationship with a person she has never met in person. The relationship is real to her. The loss of the internet does not just inconvenience her, it takes away something she loves. The episode does not mock this, it simply observes it as part of the new reality of how people were connecting with each other. By the mid-2000s, online relationships of exactly the kind Shelley has in the episode had become completely normal. People met their closest friends online. People fell in love with people they had never met in person. People built entire communities around shared interests with others they knew only through a screen. The emotional reality of these connections was no different from the emotional reality of connections made in physical spaces. Losing access to the internet did not just mean losing a tool, it meant losing the people. South Park understood this in 2008 and treated it with the seriousness it deserved. What the episode captures, across all of its storylines and all of its characters, is not just that people were using the internet a lot in 2008. It captures the specific way dependency works. The way something that starts as a convenience gradually becomes a necessity. The way the necessity becomes invisible because it is always satisfied. The way you only discover how deep the dependency goes when the thing is taken away and you are left standing in its absence, reaching for it over and over, unable to stop. That process, the quiet, invisible deepening of dependency until it becomes undeniable, is what the modern world's relationship with the internet actually looks like. South Park drew that picture in 2008 when most people had not yet looked at themselves long enough to see it. And that, in the end, is what all 12 of these episodes have in common. Not just the specific predictions, as remarkable as each of them is individually. What they have in common is a way of seeing. A willingness to look at what people are doing and follow the logic of it all the way to where it is actually going, without flinching, without looking away, and without waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. South Park looked at the internet in 2008 and saw the dependency that was already there, already growing, already shaping people in ways they could not see yet. The rest of the world spent the next 15 years catching up to what a cartoon already knew. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.